The clock is ticking for the new Prime Minister to fix Britain's armed forces. These should be their top priorities.
Just inside a tank on our way into Gaza. There is rubble and destruction as far as you can see.
They're digging in their positions, they're practicing. Point accuracy over targets is what has transformed so much of this conflict.
This is World at War. I'm the Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and joining me today is General the Lord Richard Dannatt, former Chief of the General Staff. General Dannatt, you've briefed Prime Ministers in your former role as head of the Army. What would you be saying to the Prime Minister now should be their top priorities?
Well, the first challenge that a new Prime Minister is going to have to face is to understand his responsibilities as far as Britain's nuclear deterrent is concerned. There has never been a break in our continuous at-sea deterrence, and part of that is the Prime Minister knowing his or her responsibilities, what has to be done and what is not to be done as far as ensuring our nuclear capability is completely intact. So that's the first briefing that a new Prime Minister will get. Probably quite shocking if they haven't really thought about it beforehand. Then will come a rather more laid out series of briefings, not so much for the Prime Minister, but certainly for the incoming Secretary of State for Defence. And I think we have to accept, and they have to accept, that the first duty of government is to protect the territorial integrity of this country and the security of our citizens. And that means that difficult questions are going to have to be asked about the degree to which we are ready and prepared to protect our homeland. And what we've seen from the war in Ukraine is the constant barrage of missiles and drones and indirect attacks like that being visited on Kyiv and other parts of Ukraine. And just think to ourselves, how well protected are we to defend ourselves from such attacks? And the answer is that we're not. So there needs to be a major investment in the things that can protect our homeland. And that actually means investment in our air defence systems, in our counter-missile systems. And going on from that, again, it's exacerbated by what's going on in Ukraine, is to look rapidly to restock our own supplies of ammunition and missiles to make sure that our armed forces, those that we have today, are sufficiently logistically supported to be able to carry out whatever operations they might have to be carried out. And then in slightly slower time, the new government has said it wants to conduct a strategic defence review, and I think that is right. But the conclusion they're going to come to pretty quickly, and the recent assessment that's been published this week by Dr. Rob Johnson of the Ministry of Defence's own Net Assessment Directorate, is that we are woefully unprepared and our military capability is not strong enough. And that means there needs to be an investment in more ships, particularly destroyers and frigates, to protect the sea lanes of the world, to make sure our submarine force can protect our nuclear capability. Also, if push comes to shove, that we can keep the sea lanes of communication open between ourselves and the United States. As an island nation, that we can protect our sea lanes of trading. We also need to make sure that there's a further investment in aircraft, both manned and unmanned aircraft, and then to look at our overall land capability, to ask ourselves whether our army is large enough, whether its armoured capability is sufficient, and indeed whether our provision of drones, attack drones, defensive drones, our overall air defence capability is sufficient. And the embarrassing and awkward conclusion is that we are underprepared in all these areas.
And if the Prime Minister or the Secretary of State for Defence were to say, we can't afford it, we've committed to increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP in the future, but not now. We simply can't afford to spend more on defence because it means taking money away from other things, away from health, away from education, away from the welfare that many people depend on. What would you say to that if you were delivering those briefings?
Well, I think delivering those briefings, it has to be done in such a way that what the armed forces need in the interest of this country is laid out very, very clearly to the government. That we do need more ships, we do need more submarines, we do need more fast jets, we do need a better land military capability, and all that is going to cost money. The challenge then for the government is to do its own prioritisation, between meeting the defence needs of the country or meeting the health and social welfare needs of the country. And it's a very difficult one. Yes, the outgoing Conservative government committed to 2.5% of GDP being spent on defence when it could afford it. The Labour Party during the election campaign said it would endeavour to match 2.5%, a slightly unspecified time frame. But there is a very respectable view that 2.5% of GDP on defence is itself not enough. 3% or 3.5% is more likely the sort of figure that we should be aspiring to. Think back to the days of the Cold War, when our spending on defence was between 4 and 5% of GDP, and that spending meant that we had a significant deterrent capability that prevented the Cold War from going hot. So there are some very unpleasant and unpalatable truths that an incoming government has got to face. The costs of defence have gone up. We should be considering putting more of our resource into defence than the 2.5% that they're aspiring to at the present moment. 3.5% is more like it. And it's going to come at cost of other things.
General Dannett, talking of unpalatable truths, when you were commanding the British Army, you've written that you got into a lot of trouble, in fact nearly got sacked for saying that the army was running hot. Of course, in 2006, the British Army was involved in 2 campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. I get the impression, and I'd like to know what you think, the idea that the army currently, even though it's not fighting a conflict, because it's shrunk from 102,000 to about 72,000 trained troops, is also running hot. I mean, simply trying to maintain its level of deterrent capabilities, it's exercising, its drills, it's at full stretch. Is that a fair assessment, and is it sustainable?
I mean, the army is and all the armed forces are very willing, can-do organisations. Go back to 2006, 7, 8, when we were conducting 2 significant campaigns in Iraq and Afghanistan. We had no difficulty with what the government was asking us to do. We were merely asking at the time for greater resources to be able to carry out those operations properly. And that's really where we are today. A very positive attitude being shown by the armed forces, very positive attitude being shown by the army in particular. But it's got to be resourced properly to do all the things that it needs to do. When one talks about the army running hot, it's frankly because we're prepared to do what needs to be done. But the running hot can be shown in, for example, the length of time that people have at home to spend time with their families between exercises and operations abroad. And if we get that balance wrong, and it's an element of the military covenant, if you like, something that's now been put into law, if we get that balance wrong and we ask too much of our people, the reaction to that is that we start to lose them. We hemorrhage our trained manpower such that our capability goes down even further. So this is the responsibility placed on the service chiefs.
But that is happening, isn't it? We are losing people. We're losing people faster than we can replace them. There is a recruitment crisis across the armed forces.
Yes, there is a manning challenge, there's a manning crisis, if you like. And there are 2 aspects to that. We're not recruiting enough people in, but we're also not retaining sufficient of our current trained manpower. And of course, that's the expensive bit. When you've had somebody in the armed forces for 3, 5, 10, 12 years, they have had a lot of investment in them as individuals. So to lose them at, say, the 10-year point or the 12-year point because they're exhausted and because the wider family says, look, we're not going to put up with this anymore, that is a real difficulty and a real challenge. And that all comes back to the under-resourcing, the underfunding of defence. If people feel that they're being supported by the government, they've got the right equipment, we've got the right quantum of manpower, such that the demands being placed on people are not unreasonable, then our military capability will flourish, our military capability will grow.
I mean, is there a quick fix? We need a quick fix because this problem is happening now.
The quick fix, I'm afraid, is for the government to take that difficult decision and to increase the priority that it accords to defence, and certainly go to 2.5% of GDP on defence as soon as possible, but probably go through that to 3% or 3.5%. I'm afraid people like me and other commentators will be continuing to argue for this for quite some time. We don't want to make the argument again about the parallels with the 1930s, but because we were underfunded, we didn't rearm, we very nearly were defeated as a nation in 1939, 1940. We don't want to go back to that again.
Historically, General Dannett, and I know you've written about this in your book, Victory to Defeat, I mean, have armies or countries ever been prepared for wars? We were underprepared in 1914. We faced the shell crisis. You just said, quite rightly, we were unprepared in 1939 and we were defeated in France at the beginning of World War II. It seems that it is the nature of conflict that wars erupt when countries are unprepared, and therefore it might only be a war which forces politicians to take those tough decisions.
Well, when your country is at war, you have no option but to take those tough decisions. I think the important thing, and that's why trying to learn the lessons of history is so important, to realise that far better than being forced to fight a war is to spend sufficient of your national wealth and resources on your military capability to deter war in the first place. I mean, it's often said, if you want peace, prepare for war. That's not in a warmongering way, but actually it's to say we've got a sufficient capability that if push comes to shove, we are ready to fight. But what we'd much rather do is to deter war so that we can continue for our people to live in peace and for our economy to flourish. That is far better than having valuable resources at disastrous levels being consumed in fighting a war.
General Dannett, thank you so much for sharing those thoughts with us, as those briefings no doubt taking place as we speak. Thank you very much. I'm The Sun's defence editor, Jerome Starkey, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you have any questions for me or General Dannett, please ask them in the comments below and we will do our best to answer them next week.